Yes, welcome to day 2 of RVAsec. I hope you guys are having a good time. My name is Dave Sirrine. I am a senior technical account manager at Red Hat, and I am here to entertain you about identity management. I know, who would have thought? So a little bit of an agenda here. We're going to go through introductions. What is identity? What is identity management? Why is it important? What are your options? And I'm going to try and put the sexy back in identity management here. So introductions, a little bit about me. Again, I'm a senior technical account manager at Red Hat. I primarily focus on supporting public sector customers. That's where I really got into the identity management security aspect of things, product security. I'm a community member, FreeIPA, DogTag PKI, SSSD, OpenSC, 389DS, to name a few. Again, it comes hand in hand with the work that I do. I'm a husband, father, baker, dog owner. That's my dog, Karma, right there. She is nothing but a knucklehead. And I'm a man of many interests. I've got lots of hobbies, lots of other things that I enjoy doing outside of computers and IT and identity management. And also, happy National Donut Day. Donuts are great. So, I'm about to get on my soapbox for a minute, so bear with me. What is identity? Who do you think you are, right? So, identity to me is way more than just a username and password, and it should be for everybody. I fell under the misconception or the preconception that identity management was, who's in what group, what's their password policy, those types of things, very, very low-level things. But the more you think about it and the more you get into it, it's way more than that, right? So you have to define what identity means to you. Everything has an identity. This screen, this projector has an identity. That door has an identity, right? I'm more than Dave Sirrine. I work for Red Hat. I'm over 6 feet tall. I have brown hair. I have a beard. I can drive. Well, who says I can drive? DMV says I can drive. Well, how do I prove that I can drive? I have a license, right? That's all part of my identity. So, identities are people, places, things, right? Things, hosts, services, devices. They're all identities. They all have their own unique place in our environments and descriptors that define them. So you are a unique snowflake. You are your job. You are your clothes you wear. Sorry, Tyler. If anybody gets the Fight Club reference, it's you are a unique snowflake. So why is this important, right? So knowing is half the battle, right? And please, somebody give me a G.I. Joe. Thank you very much. So your identities, your username, your password, that tells you who you have, and knowing what servers you have. When you join a server to your domain, you have that list of servers, so you know what you have. So that provides you the who and what. Now, policy provides you the when, where, and why. And policy is part of your identity. Policy is applied to your identity, right? So that goes back to the driving analogy. That's policy. So you need to understand. You need to be able to identify not just who you have, but what can they access? Why can they access it? How can they access it, right? And you need a method by which you can control that, by which you can start setting and applying that policy for your users. And please, by all means, I am a rather, I like to engage while I speak. So if anybody has any questions while I'm talking, please throw something large and heavy at me. I'm happy to answer them. I'm happy to engage because I want to make sure that I give you the information that you need rather than me just talking at you for, an hour here. So, okay, so now what are my options, right? Well, you got a lot of options out there. You've got OpenLDAP, you've got MIT Kerberos, you've got all these components, all these bits and pieces that you can kind of cobble together to make your own kind of identity provider. You have Samba and things like that. Today, I'm going to focus more on FreeIPA and a couple other sundry things. FreeIPA is a project. It exists in the Fedora project universe. It stands for Identity, Policy, and Audit. It's a bit of a misnomer because we have focused more on identity and policy and not as much on audit as folks would like us to. But we're working on that. So we're going to focus a little bit more extensively on FreeIPA than anything else today. So here's kind of a very broad stroke overview of the architecture. FreeIPA it's essentially a domain controller for your Linux environment. It has KDC built in, it's got PKI built in, LDAP, DNS, a really robust command line interface and GUI interface. You can use it to authenticate Linux systems, Unix systems, really anything that can authenticate to an LDAP identity store, you can authenticate against IDM or FreeIPA, because it is, if nothing else, just a standards-based LDAP implementation with a bunch of other tools and usability aspects built in. So digging in a little bit more to give you a little bit more insight into exactly what's going on here. Each component is provided by individual projects. So your KDC is provided by MIT Kerberos. Your DNS is provided by Bind DynDB, and Bind LDAP. Everything FreeIPA does, everything it manages, is stored in LDAP. So that also makes it really easy for you to do your own custom reporting. As long as you know how to do an LDAP search, you can get the data out of LDAP and massage it to whatever you need. The LDAP backend is based on 389DS, and the PKI is provided by DogTag PKI. It is a very feature-rich certificate authority, secure key archival recovery. It provides all that functionality. And it's client-server based, so the server is IPA server. The clients are FreeIPA client. So you would set up your FreeIPA server, and then on your individual hosts, you would run you would install the client portion of it, and it'll join it to the domain, automatically add the host to the host database in the IPA server, and configure your authentication to authenticate against it. It'll do all that for you. And then you have the other component here, which is SSSD. Think of that as your authentication gateway. That is what you're configuring to tell your Linux systems to, I want to authenticate against FreeIPA, and this is what I want FreeIPA to provide back to me. So any questions? Any questions so far? Sir?
IPA client, that's just for Linux-based.
Yeah, that's just Linux-based. So the question was, the FreeIPA client, is that just Linux-based, or is there a Unix aspect to that? It's just Linux. There may be some hand-rolled implementations out there for like maybe BSD or something like that, but as provided by the project, there's an installer for Ubuntu, obviously Fedora, RHEL, CentOS, those types of implementations. Thank you. All right, so FreeIPA, the features that it provides, it's your centralized authentication, Kerberos, by Kerberos or LDAP. It also, manages your identities, so your users groups, your host groups, net groups, services. Again, we're starting to broaden the scope of what is an identity. Services, definitely an identity, because we want to know what services we have running, where they're running, and how people can access them. Some user lifecycle management aspects here. So we have different levels. You could have staged users where you have a group of, say, interns coming in a month. You can stage them up. They're inactive, ready to go, but they have no real policy applied to them until you put them active, and then folks can start using those identities. And then once they're done, if you need to preserve them for auditing purposes or if it's a contractor who's on a 9-month contract, then 3 months off, and then comes back for another 9-month contract, you can put them in a preserved state, and then when they come back, you can move them back into an active state. So it helps you ensure that you don't have any active users who should not be active. And manageability. So it's a simple installation script. So for IPA server, it's FreeIPA-server-install. And it'll ask you a couple questions about whether or not you want to use DNS, what you want your realm name to be, what your passwords are going to be. You can also pass it an answers file to help automate that process as well. Same thing with the client side. It's just FreeIPA client install, and it'll ask you a couple questions. The client side will do a DNS lookup against an SRV record to see if there are any, automatically discover any existing FreeIPA servers in your infrastructure. And it'll ask you, we found this one, do you want to use it, right? To authenticate against. So, it's got a very rich command line interface and web-based UI. It's all based on a back-end RESTful API that will be exposed and supported here soon, I hope. But that means anything that you can do in the UI, you can do in the command line interface, and vice versa. We try and keep feature parity between the UI and the command line interface. Really helpful when you're trying to automate these workflows, these business processes, right? Because the more you can automate it and build it into your business needs and your business workflow, the less likely you're going to have errant users out there just hanging out, not doing anything, and that shouldn't be, right? If you can automate, the better you can automate, the better you're going to be. And flexible delegation of administrative roles. So we could get pretty granular about when we set up administrators for FreeIPA, what can they do? Can we just view users? Can we modify users? Can we create users? Can we limit folks to just managing policies? Like, can this person just be a pseudo rules administrator? We can get pretty granular with how we can delegate administrative responsibilities within FreeIPA. So some more features, replication. Again, this is a pretty standards-based LDAP implementation. So you can have multi-master replication agreements between multiple FreeIPA servers. This helps to distribute load and helps you scale within your environment. Also helps for redundancy, disaster recovery type situations as well. So recommended deployment is usually 2,000 to 3,000 clients per server. So when I say clients, I mean hosts. So if you're connecting 2,000 to 3,000 servers to a single FreeIPA server instance, then you might want to think about rolling out another FreeIPA server to start picking up some of those additional clients. And again, the details depend on the number of data centers and the geographical locations. So you can pretty much set it up however you want in your environment, right? So if you have data centers in the US and in the UK, you can have FreeIPA servers in both locations, set up a replication agreement between them, and that way you're authenticating locally in certain instances. So any questions? Still no questions? All right. Backup and restore. There's a variety of different ways you can back up and restore here. There's some tools that come with it. You have DB to back and DB to LDIF. So you can either take a binary copy of your database, or you can take a full LDIF dump of your databases. So, and compatibility with a broad set of clients. Again, this is what we say about compatibility with a broad set of clients is going to depend on what you're looking for when you yourself think about compatibility. So again, anything that can authenticate against just a very basic LDAP infrastructure can authenticate against LDAP, right? So if you can point it against LDAP, you can point it against FreeIPA and authenticate. But if you're looking to get the bells and whistles and policy applied and things like that, then you're going to be a little bit more limited. Again, basically, it's just your RHEL-based, Fedora-based installs that come with SSSD are going to be able to provide you that policy management on a per host basis. So some of the policy features, this gets pretty in-depth here. We can do centrally managed pseudo rules, SE Linux context, host-based access control, is automatically add hosts and users to groups. So you can start automatically applying policy once a user or a host is connected to FreeIPA. I like telling the story, specifically when in the RHEL world. We have a product called Satellite, right? And Satellite 6, FreeIPA or IDM plugs into that. And when you start provisioning systems using Satellite, it'll automatically add the host entry into, FreeIPA. And once that host is added, based on some regex that you apply to your auto membership rules, it'll automatically add that host to a host group. Now that host, immediately out of the box, as soon as it's provisioned, has policy applied to it, right? So that helps mitigate those gaps in time between provisioning and policy application, right? It's applied at the time of provisioning. So those types of automated process and automated workflow really helps out in the enterprise world. And again, tying this back into identity management, right? You're managing the identity of that server that you just set up. So again, out of the box, we want to make sure that policy is as applied as possible to that host without a gap in time. So, some additional things, there's different POSIX data sets. You can do centrally managed SSH keys for your users, auto mounts, things like that. It's fairly robust, and all of this really helps ease your administrative overhead in your Linux environment, because now you're not managing these policies on a per host basis. You're managing them in one central location, and you're managing them hopefully on a host level, not on a per user, on a group level, not on a per user level, to make your administrative headache even less, right? So now when somebody leaves, you don't have to go across your entire data center and say, well, was this user in my sudoers file? Did this user have, auto mount rules set up on this box? You just go right in here, delete the user, and automatically pulled out of the groups, and you don't have to worry about that policy anymore. So we can also manage two-factor authentication in smart cards. So FreeIPA can manage any HOTP or TOTP token or soft tokens. I personally use, I have a YubiKey 4 that has the PIV applet and PIV reader on it, PGP and OTP. But you can use pretty much any HOTP or TOTP token that you want. Or a soft token, again, like FreeOTP on your smartphone or Google Authenticator or something like that. Or if you already have, say, RSA Secure ID set up in your environment, you can configure RSA Secure ID to act as a radius server, and you can proxy those OTP authentication requests up to that RSA Secure ID server as part of that user's authentication process. So as long as it can be set up as a radius server, you can bring your own OTP solution. So, and as far as smart cards, we can't provision smart cards yet with FreeIPA, though that is on the roadmap. But if you already have smart cards that you're using, you can pull the user certificate off of the smart card, put the binary certificate into the user's entry in the LDAP database, and now you can start doing certificate verification against that certificate binary. And that's done either by SSSD or a PAM module called PAM PKCS11. So SSSD does dbus lookup, while PAM PKCS11 does all the PKCS calls and checks. Any questions? Any questions? No? Okay. All right, so it provides DNS. It's not required, but it's strongly recommended. I would personally require it if I could, because FreeIPA runs primarily on Kerberos and PKI. And there are two things that Kerberos and PKI is critical for that to function: time and name, right? So if you're controlling your own DNS, then you are slightly more assured that your FQDNs that you have set are pointing to the right place and you have the right DNS records in place to ensure that this is going to function appropriately. And we do have built-in DNSSEC support. This was tech preview when it was released in RHEL 7.2 as part of the RHEL platform, but it is in FreeIPA and should be out of tech preview by 7.3. So, and the disadvantage here is you need to delegate a zone for now. Again, we're working on that. And what I mean by delegate a zone, let's say you have your DNS infrastructure set up today in your Active Directory environment, and your realm is, or your DNS zone is ad.example.com, right? You can't add FreeIPA to ad.example.com. It has to be linux.example.com or linux.ad.example.com. It can't be, you can't add it to that zone. All right, so some CA-related functionality. This is my wheelhouse. I love talking about PKI because I'm a bit of a nerd. But certificate provisioning for users, so you can, with FreeIPA, you can issue certificates for users, for services, so your SSL certs. You can do host-based certificates. In FreeIPA 4, I think it was FreeIPA, the first release of 4, you can now manage custom certificate profiles. So if you have a specific use case that you're issuing certificates for, you can create your own custom certificate profile. So you can manage the life cycle of the certificate, the not before, not after, your certificate extensions, things like that. So you can really make it what you need it to be in your environment. You can deploy FreeIPA in a couple different ways with the CA. You can either choose to not implement a CA if you don't want to. You can be a subordinate of an existing root CA. So you can have the CA that FreeIPA provides be a subordinate of your root CA, so it's part of that trust chain. Or it can be its own self-signed CA. Those are your three options. And we make it pretty easy to switch between, if you set it up with no CA and then you're like, well, I want it to be a self-signed CA, it's pretty easy to make it a self-signed CA. And then if you wanted to make it a subordinate, you can change that as well midstream without having to reinstall. And it also comes with a secure key archival and recovery. We call it the Vault. It's based off of our KRA from Dogtag. So that's where you're keeping cryptographically wrapped secrets. So you can use it to store user private keys. You can use it to store passwords, anything like that. So Requisite Meme, your PKI is bad, and you should feel bad, because PKI is hard, and or historically has been hard. Most people have a hard time implementing it. We're really trying hard to make it a lot easier to implement good PKI. So if it's something you've played with before in the past and want to look at it again, because we should all be signing and encrypting emails. We should. I mean, we should. All right. And it's worth taking a look at again because technology has advanced and it's getting a lot easier to implement. And I'm happy to take any questions, offline about PKI if anybody is really super curious. So I figured I'd have a little bit of time, and I do, to take a little stroll through some of the web UI. Because again, most people, they're going to spend most of their time in the web UI, not a lot of time in the CLI, but I do get into that a little bit in a few. But this is just some quick screenshots of what the UI looks like and some of the tabbing here, right? So as you can see, we can manage identity policy, authentication mechanisms, your network services, and configurations for the IPA server itself. again, you got users, user groups, hosts, host groups, net groups, services, and auto member. I mentioned that auto member before, where you can set up rules and policies where if I add a user with a certain structure to their name, right? Like if you have certain naming conventions, or for groups, certain naming conventions, we can set auto member policies to say, well, if a user gets added with this certain, in these certain groups or with this certain pattern, we can automatically apply policy to that user based on that auto membership rule. Same thing with hosts. And it's all based on just simple regex. Just throw some regex in there when you create your rule. All right. So the next tab, a little bit smaller, but I wanted to make sure that I took and gave a little bit more context here. So for policy, you've got your host-based access controls. Here we're saying, these users can only access these systems. And I like to give the example of, and you'll have to excuse me, I have to use jazz hands whenever I say this word, so the DevOps. In the DevOps world, right? Let's say you have 5 developers who are doing rapid development and deployment on these servers, and they need to be able to quickly deploy, test, troubleshoot code. So we're going to set up these 5 users in a group that's like this project-dev group, right? And per that group, we're going to start applying policies. We're going to start applying your host-based access control rules. So anybody in this group can only access these 5 development servers. And then you're going to do centrally managed pseudo rules here, where anybody in this dev group can only run these commands on these 5 servers. So now, if those developers try and log into this production web server and try, A, they won't be able to because they're going to be explicitly denied based on host-based access control rules. And B, that's it, right? So when they do get into the development servers, they're going to say, well, I want to install this other package. Well, because when you've done your you've set up your pseudo rules correctly, they're not going to be able to run yum, because they're not going to be able to sudo yum install whatever. They're only going to be able to sudo service, I want to restart Tomcat. We're going to explicitly provide them the ability to restart Tomcat, and that's it. And also, based on group membership, we can start applying auto mount policies where, on these 5 servers, these developers are going to automatically have their code directories mounted into this server, so they can have access to their code and their documentation and things like that. So now you can start seeing how policy is starting to come together and tell a story about what a user can and cannot do, why, where they can go. So again, we have the who and what. We have the services, the hosts, and the users. Now we need the why, the when, the where, right? So again, for the host-based access control rules, we can do it based on the host itself. We can do it based on services. So any host that's running these services, this user can access, and service groups. So again, if you have developers who are working on LAMP stacks, right, you can add your Apache service, your MySQL service, and your PHP service to a service group, and any host that's in this service group, that user can access, right? So now you're even making it easier to control and easier to provide access to what users actually need. And pseudo rules, you're setting up the rule itself, you're setting up what commands they can use, and you can also set up command groups. So, again, if a group of developers needs to have access to a group of commands, you can set up a command group. That way you're not giving, one command, you're not doing it on an ad hoc basis, right? You're just applying one group of commands to the user. So any questions? I know this is a lot of information. It can be pretty dense, and I'm trying to make it as interesting as possible. Sir?
So like on the pseudo rules, does the server actually query back to the LDAP for that information, or do you push something out that updates like local security file?
That's a great question, and I'm actually going to answer that. So the question was, does the server reach out to LDAP to check and see what the pseudo rules are? Or does the LDAP server push pseudo rules down to the host? The answer is, when the user authenticates, SSSD is going to, if you have SSSD configured to manage pseudo rules locally, it will query LDAP and apply those pseudo rules for that session for that user. So it's going to override the local pseudo policy and apply those policies based on whatever LDAP has. So it's on a per session basis. So and it pulls it from LDAP at authentication time. Yeah, anytime. All right, so authentication mechanisms. Here we've got your certificates, your OTP tokens, and your radius servers. Again, I talked about this a little bit earlier. This is where you would set up, you would, do your, grab your certificates, manage your certificate profiles, and your CA access control lists. You can configure and manage your OTP tokens. Managing OTP tokens is actually really nice because you can set it up in a self-service kind of way where users can go to a particular self-service screen, a self-service portal, where they have their information and they'll get a QR code. So if they wanted to use Google Authenticator or FreeOTP, soft token on their phone, they can go to that self-service site and say, well, I want to register this new OTP token and register it. So that takes a little bit of the administrative overhead off of your administrators, allows for better BYOD type situations. But again, that's going to be up to you whether or not you want to allow that. That's all configurable. You can not allow that if you don't want to. Sir?
So you were describing TOTP for OTP tokens like RSA.
Sure.
Hardware-based. You can set those up as well?
Yep. So the question was being able to set up TOTP hardware-based tokens. Absolutely. Again, I use the here we go. I use this. It's the YubiKey 4. It's TOTP. It's HOTP token. So, and I have it set up in my FreeIPA server at home. So. All right, but again, this is where you would go to manage those, manage your OTP tokens. What's nice about that as well is you can delegate administrative control. You can say, you can set up administrators as, this person's the owner of this token, this person's the user of this token, or this person's the administrator of this token, right? So that's going to limit what those people can actually do with that token. So network services, you can start setting up your auto mount locations here. So you can start, providing those auto mount locations to user groups, host groups, etc. And for DNS, you can set up, your DNS zones. You can have multiple DNS zones. You can have, you can set up your reverse lookups here. Those types of things, and it supports all the standard DNS records, so your SRV records, your TXT records, those types of things. So, and managing the IPA server itself, again, role-based access control. This is for your FreeIPA administrators, so you can start locking down what your administrators can do, whether or not you want them to be able to provision users, provision policy, what policy they can provision. So you're not just handing the keys to the kingdom to somebody and say, I want you to just manage pseudo rules, but you can manage everything else as well, but stay in your box, right? We all know that people won't stay in their box if given the option. So ID ranges, you can custom set your ID ranges. So if you want one FreeIPA server to issue UIDs and GIDs from 1 million to 2 million, you can set that here. And the other one will be from 3 million to 4 million, right? That way, it gives you a little bit more of administrative control to figure out, okay, well, this UID was 1,100,000. We know which FreeIPA server issued that credential, right? Based on that ID range. So other things, ID views, realm domains. So ID views, if you are using FreeIPA in an Active Directory trust type situation, I'm going to get into trust here in a second, you can override certain attributes that Active Directory will send down to FreeIPA using ID views. But I've got about 15 minutes left, so I want to move on to actually talk a little bit about Active Directory trusts. But here's a couple examples of the command line interface. It's pretty self-explanatory. So if I want to do anything that's user ID based, it's going to be IPA space user something, right? It's going to be either user add, user del, user whatever. And then you have group. Again, it's pretty self-explanatory. And again, if I wanted to, programmatically add pseudo rules or pseudo groups, anything like that, you can do it from the command line here just by passing it the option and a couple arguments. So SSSD, talked about this a little bit earlier. This is what is going to be your authentication gateway. This is what facilitates the authentication request from the host to FreeIPA. This is where you're going to configure whether or not you want it to manage pseudo rules, SSH keys, auto mount policies, things like that. You're going to configure that in your SSSD configuration file, and it will take over from there. Primarily works on dbus controls. Sir, in the back. The question was, is there a Puppet module available for FreeIPA? I would bet you there is. You mean to provision FreeIPA? Yeah, I'll bet you there is. I don't know. I've seen quite a bit work done with Ansible, but I would bet you I'd be surprised if there wasn't. I'm just not personally aware of one. So you can use SSSD to authenticate, to set up to authenticate to just about anything. SSSD can be set up to do a direct trust relationship, direct authentication to Active Directory if you wanted to, bypassing FreeIPA altogether, or really just about any other kind of identity provider. And what's nice here is you can set up multiple identity providers in one SSSD configuration file. So if you have users in Centrify and some users in, eDirectory or some users in, some open LDAP database somewhere, you can set all those sources up in one SSSD file. And if it doesn't find the user in the first one, moves on to the second one. Doesn't find them there, moves on to the third one. If it doesn't find them there, it'll fail, obviously. But it allows you to provide multiple sources if that's something that's required in your environment. And it also provides credential caching, for a mobile workforce or for maybe a data center that has connectivity issues where you may lose connection back to home base, from time to time. So it'll cache credentials. You can configure it to whether or not you want it to cache credentials and for how long you want it to cache credentials. So a little bit about Active Directory integration. You're setting up a cross-force trust between FreeIPA and Active Directory. What this is going to do is it's going to use Active Directory as your authoritative source of identity. So all your users and groups are going to be still managed and configured up in Active Directory. And you're going to map those groups locally in FreeIPA, and you're going to apply policy based on group membership. So what happens is when SSSD says, hey, FreeIPA, do you have this user? FreeIPA is going to say, nah, man, but let me go ask Active Directory. Active Directory is going to say yes, and he's going to send what's called a PAC back. And the PAC is a certificate that contains all your user information. And what we are most concerned about here is what groups you're a member of. And again, you're going to map the groups that you want here locally in FreeIPA, and based on that group membership, we're going to start applying the Linux-specific policy. So any questions on this? And what's nice here is if you're in a primarily Windows shop and you've been trying to do a good solution for authenticating against Active Directory for a while, this helps you speak the same language that your Active Directory administrators speak. Because setting up your cross-forest trust here is essentially the same way you would set up cross-forest trust from Active Directory to Active Directory. So you're talking the same language. You're able to use the same vernacular, right? So it should help ease that conversation. So one last little piece to this puzzle is realm D. Realm D is the service that's actually used. Remember how I mentioned earlier when you would do an IPA client install, it will do a DNS search to check if there are any existing realms out there that you can join. It uses realm D to do this. There are several ways you can use realm D: command line, dbus interface, through a system installer, or from a desktop application. Really simple. It's similar to what many folks are used to using when trying to do Active Directory integration. You want to join, leave, those types of things for the realm. But that's what's used to join these systems. So just a little bit more about Active Directory integration. So as you can tell, we're either going to use LDAP or Kerberos for our authentication to Active Directory, which is going to be proxied through FreeIPA. The identities are going to be provided by the Active Directory LDAP database, but all the policy is going to be provided by FreeIPA. So a little bit more about SSSD-based integration. So it buys you the same thing, right? Active Directory is maintained as your sole source of identity, but you don't get any of the policy, right? So you're not managing users and groups locally anymore, but you also don't get those additional bells and whistles that are applied by FreeIPA. And here's some pretty pictures. It shows you, what services map to what services in FreeIPA. It's pretty self-explanatory. So you have your CA chain, you have your delegated DNS zones, you've got your cross-forest trust between KDC and KDC, and now here's how it all works together. Bit of a spaghetti graph, but it does a decent job of showing you how it all works together. And again, it shows you what's provided by FreeIPA and what's provided by your Active Directory. Sir.
I saw the last slide, the cross-forest trust wasn't supported, then I heard this.
Oh, so that last slide was just SSSD direct integration with Active Directory. This is FreeIPA to Active Directory. I apologize if that wasn't super clear. So, this one? Yeah, this is direct integration to SSSD-based direct integration to Active Directory. Where I'm at now is SSSD to to FreeIPA to Active Directory. So this is what we call indirect integration. I think a slide got dropped out of here because I should have been more clear in that distinction. So I apologize. But yeah, no, cross-forest trust is certainly supported from FreeIPA to Active Directory. So yeah, some of the pros. No synchronization required. Previously, the way to integrate with Active Directory was through user and password synchronization. Not a great solution, right? A lot of people are worried about that, understandably so. But the requirement, proper DNS setup, right? Again, we're back to ensuring that DNS and your time synchronization is accurate. So some user mapping information. You can leverage your SFU IMU for POSIX. You can do dynamic mapping of SIDs and GIDs. This is done at the SSSD level. And you can do static overrides with ID views. So, again, for example, you can do static overrides for SSH keys, things like that through ID views. All right, and so two-way and one-way trusts. Some things that we're working on as well is some better Samba integration with FreeIPA to be a more robust domain controller. And you can also migrate if you're currently using a sync type topology. You can migrate to a trust pretty easily. So a little bit about another thing that is provided out there that's really nice when you're talking about identities is federated identity. How many people here are familiar with federated identity, the concept of federated identity? Oh, a couple hands, that's nice. So there's a couple projects out there called Ipsilon and Keycloak. They're there to help provide SAML, OpenID Connect, OAuth, type federated identity services, right? This is your bring your own IDP, your own identity provider. You know, it's kind of helpful. It's really helpful in the web services world, so you don't have to manage your own information store. You can just say, hey, you can go ahead and authenticate using your Facebook credentials, right? If you're okay with that. But what's really nice as well is, you know, internally, you know, doing service-to-service authentication, right? You want to be able to limit the amount of identities people need to have, right? So a couple interesting and upcoming things. One thing I really wanted to mention because it's super cool, called Clevis and Tang. It's asynchronous secret sharing based on environment data. So the use case that started this whole project was Lux whole disk encryption, right? Let's say you have a data center with 1,000 servers and you want to encrypt all those disks using Lux. Now you have to think of, well, if I have a power outage, now I got to go around and hand enter a password into 1,000 servers. Ain't nobody got time for that, right? So what this does is it's a service that runs, and if you're on a specific, for example, as long as the server is on a specific subnet and has another specific environment variable that you can control to ensure that it's where it is and where it should be, it'll send a request to Clevis and Tang as a client-server relationship. The host will send a request back to Clevis and say, hey, you know, here's my environmental variables. You know, can I unlock my disk? The server will send back, well, yeah, but send me your private key, or send me your key. Then they'll do a key exchange, and if all of that works well, you can cryptographically, you know, use key-based decryption for your Lux disks. It's still very early on, but a really interesting concept. Again, this ties into identity because we need to know the identity of that server, where it should be, who it should be, what it should be, to be able to decrypt this disk, right? So really super interesting, and if it's something that's interesting to you, I would highly recommend checking it out. I have a link to a blog post about it later on in the deck. But talking about, you know, Unix-based, you know, policy management, there are modules out there, PAM modules. You have a new one called PAM HBAC that you can use for your Solaris systems that can allow you to provide the host-based access control policy management for your Unix systems through IPA. It's something that's not supported yet. It's fairly new. But again, something to take a look at if you have a non-homogeneous environment and you wanted to try and use this for your Unix type infrastructure. Same thing with PAM sudo. So why is this all important? You know, as I've said, you know, we need to know, we already know what we have and who we have. Now we need to know why we have it, why these people can access what they can access, where can they access it, when can they access it. All of this is a part of identity management, right? All of this is part of your identity solution. And you need to have a good, robust infrastructure for identity management to have that insight into your environment. By the way, auditors love it if you can give them a report that says this user can access these, here's why, and here's how we specifically deny them access to everything else, right? And a solution like FreeIPA puts all that information right there at your fingertips to leverage. And we all need to put the sexy back in identity management. Everybody kind of glazes over when you start talking about identity management, but there's so much more to it, so much more complexity, and it really starts getting interesting, right? Because it starts solving business problems. And we all need to be a part of solving business problems, right? Even your basic low-level systems administrator. We're all security professionals. We all should be security professionals. And this, in my opinion, is a huge part of security, right? Is understanding the who's, the what's, the when's, the where's, the why's, and the how's. And now that I'm wrapping up, here's where you can find me. I'm on Twitter at @dsirrine. Also have a blog I've just recently started. I also hang out on Freenode and FreeIPA and Dogtag PKI. And the slides will be available, but here's some links to some resources. There is a live demo on freeipa.org where you can go and click around the interface and kind of kick the tires. So thank you very much. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to hit me up in the hall.